Hello, it's Scott Manley here. Nobody can accuse Elon Musk of not talking about big ideas for the future, and over the years we've seen and heard about a number of SpaceX rockets which were announced and then later fell by the wayside as the company's business model evolved. And so I thought it would be interesting to go back and look at the rockets which were once the logical next step for SpaceX, but never made it to flight. And of course, the place that we have to start is with the Falcon 1. And back when SpaceX started, it was only known as the Falcon. It was named, of course, after a certain legendary Star Wars spacecraft. Now, for reference, the Falcon used a single Merlin 1 engine for the first stage and a pressure-fed Kestrel engine for the second stage. The rocket was roughly 22 meters tall and massed 30 tons, fully fueled. The early Falcons used the Merlin 1A, which had an ablative nozzle and a combustion chamber, but later flights they used the improved Merlin 1C with regenerative cooling and higher thrusts. According to SpaceX's early announcements, the Falcon would be able to launch a 600 kilogram payload into orbit for a price of $6 million. But by the time it was actually flying, this had changed to 400 kilogram payloads for $9 million. The 5 flights of the Falcon 1 were all carried out from the Kwajalein Atoll in the South Pacific, but long before the Falcon 1 ever flew, SpaceX was already talking about upgraded versions. In 2003, SpaceX said that the Falcon Heavy would be the next evolution of the Falcon. But this is not the Falcon Heavy we know and love. This was 3 Falcon 1 cores strapped together with a single Falcon 1 upper stage. This would have the ability to put 1.4 tons into low Earth orbit. The concept appears in early SpaceX PR material and in a paper by Elon, Hans and Gwynne. But the plan for the Falcon Heavy was dropped soon after SpaceX started announcing multi-engine versions of the Falcon, so the Falcon became the Falcon 1. The first multi-engine Falcon concept was announced at a press conference in 2003 where they had the first Falcon 1 on show. I'm sure you can guess that the Falcon 5 had 5 Merlin engines in the first stage, it had 2 Kestrel engines in the second stage, the rocket would now be 3.7 meters diameter, which is the diameter of the current Falcons. It would be 29 meters tall and about 130 tons at launch. This would be aimed at delivering 4 tons to low Earth orbit, and Elon actually suggested that it would be able to deliver cargo to the International Space Station. It would also have the capability of delivering satellites to geostationary orbit and had a projected cost of $12 million per launch. He also talked about an upgraded version of the Falcon 5 where they would use more powerful Merlin engines, it would allow them to stretch the booster tanks, and the second stage would move over to using liquid hydrogen powered by an RL-10 engine. And while that sounds great, I'm pretty sure the RL-10 engine would have cost more than the rest of the rocket put together. The Falcon 5 morphed somewhat over time. The engines were upgraded, the second stage was switched to use a single Merlin engine with a nozzle extension, and in 2005 the Falcon 9 was announced. And we all know that this is the future that they ultimately went with, and that's what happened, but the Falcon 5 didn't get abandoned right away. In a major redesign aimed at removing redundancy from the manufacturing process, the Falcon 5 switched to using the same booster tanks as the Falcon 9, but with only 5 engines, essentially a Falcon 9 with 4 engines removed. The tanks would only be partially filled so that the engines could lift it. The cost of flight then rose as a result and the payload mass dropped. At the same time, there was something called the Falcon 9S5, which was like the modern Falcon Heavy, but with Falcon 5 boosters strapped on. This was announced in parallel with the 9S9, the concept which is much more like the modern Falcon Heavy. And that was the last incarnation of the Falcon 5 that we saw before it disappeared from SpaceX documents in 2007. At the same time, the Falcon 1 program was continuing and they were actually having test launches. They did have a lot of problems in the early days with the Merlin engines, and then they had a series of problems with the rockets, but they continued trying to sell the Falcon 1 to customers, and so they announced the Falcon 1E. The Falcon 1E converted the structure of the Falcon to a lighter weight aluminium lithium alloy. It stretched the tanks and it had a larger payload fairing, adding about 5 more meters to the rocket and raising the mass closer to about 40 tons. The Merlin 1C engine, with its new fancy regeneratively cooled combustion chamber, was able to deliver 30% more thrust, and SpaceX said that the Falcon 1E would put 1 ton into low Earth orbit for the sum of $11 million. The first flight was scheduled for 2010, but with NASA's commercial crew development bringing in the real money for Falcon 9, the Falcon 1E development was suspended as SpaceX put all its effort into making NASA happy. On top of this, the economic crash killed a lot of potential smallsat customers, so SpaceX weren't turning down massive profits by shelving Falcon 1E. Finally, in 2012, SpaceX announced that the payloads that had been booked for the Falcon 1E were all shifted over to the Falcon 9 as secondary payloads. The final abandoned Falcon concept was the Falcon 9 Air, which was part of a collaboration with Stratolaunch that began in 2011. The concept was an air-launched version of the Falcon 9, which would work with the massive Stratolaunch carrier aircraft. Despite being named Falcon 9, it only had 4 engines in the first stage, and to add to the confusion, the early concept video showed it with 5 engines. With the help of the Stratolaunch aircraft, it could have been able to put maybe 6 tons into orbit. Because it would be air-launched, the Falcon Air included a wing which would be built by scaled composites. And over time, the design evolution meant that more and more specialization of the rocket was required, which differentiated it from the old-fashioned ground-launched version. Primarily, the structural loads which were required or generated by hanging a fully fueled rocket sideways in a plane are radically different from the structural loads on a rocket standing vertically in the launch pad. So that meant that the degree of commonality between the Falcon 9 and the Falcon 9 Air disappeared, which meant that it was less economical than SpaceX had originally imagined. So eventually SpaceX decided that it was no longer the route that it wanted to pursue, and they dropped out of Stratolaunch, leaving the Falcon 9 Air on the drawing board. Finally, I guess we should also mention that there was a version of the Falcon Heavy originally pitched that used the Falcon 9 1.0. The Falcon 9 1.0, of course, didn't have the Octaweb engine arrangement. It had them arranged in a grid, and it was a whole lot shorter. So the original renderings of the Falcon Heavy are of this design. Clearly, that was never built, largely because they had moved over to the larger Falcon 9 1.1, and so that's why the second version of the Falcon Heavy never flew. So yeah, those are the Falcon rockets that SpaceX never built. Plans were made, numbers were crunched, renderings happened, but none of these actually flew. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.